The King of Happy Kingdom. Happy Kingdom was not a very happy place, and had not been for quite some time. The people were in a terrible malaise as they went through the motions of their daily affairs. Down in the market square, which should have been hustling and bustling with happy shoppers, the denizens were moving like they hadn't had their morning coffee. Of course, most hadn't, what with how expensive coffee had become. "Morning, Berry Bear," greeted the not-so-young woman, her smile forced yet polite. Berry Bear looked up from his stall with a far more sincere grin. "Ah, Donna dear, so good to see you." Donna's laugh was more of an exhale through her nose. "Someone's in a good mood. Care to share with the rest of us?" "Gladly." The bear clapped his hands together before motioning down to the produce he had on display. "My carrots were affected by last week's chill. They all turned out perfect." Donna's mouth watered as the unusually aromatic vegetables tickled her senses. "The color, the shape, and especially the flavor are all perfect," bragged Barry, straightening his shirt with his unusually dexterous brown paws. "And with the fog gone, I might actually make a profit today." Donna's mood instantly soured. "Then they're full-priced?" Barry sheepishly rubbed the back of his head. "Sorry, didn't mean to be insensitive. I know things haven't been easy." "I'm not as bad off as others," Donna corrected, hating the idea of being pitied. "I'm a washer in the castle, and—" She trailed off with a knowing smirk. "King give you a lot of work?" asked the bear with a contemptuous sneer. Donna shrugged and discreetly looked around for eavesdroppers. "If he hadn't abolished overtime and paid me what I was worth, I'd probably be one of the richest people here." The pair shared a hushed snicker. "But seriously, I'm glad you're doing all right." Better than most, I'm afraid. Millie Mutton's radishes look like raisins. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it for myself." "At least the muttons still have their wool to fall back on. That's something," Donna added, wanting to interject some hope. Barry sighed. "Things just aren't what they used to be." He hung his head low. "I miss the old king." "What about old king?" Despite being a little more than a whisper, perfectly library acceptable, the voice was still booming. Chills, shivers, and shakes went through the bodies of all who heard, especially those who were being spoken to. Donna spun around and craned her neck back to regard the speaker. "Sheriff Bumble." She tried to keep her tone even and her knees from quaking. How nice to see you this morning." Rumble Bumble, recently appointed sheriff, just stared down at the doe with dead yellow eyes. He was about half as wide as a nearby food cart, a head taller than Barry's stall, and was vaguely squarish and blocky in shape. Only a fool would ever call him fat, though, especially if he were in earshot, which he always seemed to be. That was all muscle he sported, which he put to impressive use on many occasions. In recent memory, his most prominent feat had been knocking aside the kingdom's guards and single-handedly battering down the castle gate. Despite his size, the new sheriff had the frightening ability to move without making a sound and sneak up on anyone. The old gator blinked after a second of silence, looked around as though he'd forgotten where he was, and then went back to glowering at Donna and Barry. Was he glowering, though? He seemed to only have the one expression of perpetual bad mood, so it was hard to tell. Rumble's eyes then widened in remembrance as he tapped the gold star pinned to his tattered old vest, the same he'd worn back when he and the new king lived out in the swamp. "I heard you say old king. What about old king?" He probably wasn't trying to sound threatening, His voice just naturally had that kind of inflection. What? No, no. Very strange to say. I didn't say that. I was, the old kind, Donna finished. He was saying he missed the old kind of fertilizer he used to use. Isn't that right, Barry? Oh, right. Yeah. The new kind of fertilizer I get which works great. He motioned to his carrots. But it stinks something fierce. Barry pinched his nose and motioned, fanning away the foul odor. Phew. The gator sniffed the air and then exhaled a mighty gust upon the shaking mammals. His breath smelled of old swamp rot, which was ironic given his next words. Stinky? I don't like stinky. The, stink goes away after it's used, Barry explained, trying to keep things simple for the simple beast. He then added, Would you like to try one? The gator's brow seemed to strain, pulling taut as it furrowed in thought. No doubt this was a feat of Herculean proportions for the overgrown reptile. They good? Oh, yes, very good. Here. Barry selected the very finest specimen he had on display and offered it to the sheriff. Try one. Grumble blinked. How much? Oh, it's on the house. Just a reward for you being such a good sheriff. Barry strained on that last part. Grumble blinked again, his expression seeming to soften, and he took the offered bribe. The tiny orange stick was thinner than his finger, and he turned it over before his eye. Once satisfied, he parted his massive jaws and popped the itsy-bitsy morsel onto his tongue. Mmm! He exclaimed in what everyone on the street hoped wasn't a bad sign. Carrot good. I like. Barry released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I'm happy to hear that. So, Grumble swallowed. You no say, old king? Barry vehemently shook his head. Never. Good. New king no like talk about old king. Make mad. Make yell. Grumble then rubbed his scalp where the latest lump was only just going down. Make hurt. No like. Well, we certainly wouldn't want that, Barry agreed. An awkward pause followed as the gator and bear stared at one another. Only the latter was aware they had an audience, as every shopper and seller in sight watched them with dead silence. It was eerie, and the bear found himself silently begging for someone to save him from this awful moment. Donna began, only to stumble. Not helping was how all eyes, mainly the big gator's, descended upon her. But, fighting the urge to just bolt away, as her kind was wont to do in moments of stress, she fought through her instincts and followed through with her plan. Shouldn't you get back to patrolling? She asked, trying with all her might to shape her words into a suggestion that, in no way, could be misconstrued as an order. You are the sheriff, after all. People rely on you to patrol. Once more, Grumble adopted that laborious, thoughtful expression of his. I guess so. He then turned, his mighty tail swinging and somehow managing not to hit anything. It was a trick he'd mastered back when he and the new king still lived in their shack. He walked casually down through the market, the pedestrians pressing themselves to the edges to give him the much-needed space to pass. Each step gave a small rumble and left notable indentions in the dirt. After the tremors were no longer felt, everyone let out a mighty sigh of relief. That was close. Donna leaned on the stall to keep from collapsing. I'm so glad that worked. You're not the only one, heaved Barry, now grinning like the happiest Ursine alive. I thought I'd have to change my trousers if that went on any longer. Donna laughed sympathetically. Deciding against sharing her embarrassment, she hurried to finish what she'd come for before things started stinking. By the way, I'll have 3 dozen carrots. In the last half hour, the king of all he surveyed had made 3 servants cry with his yelling, spat only half of his breakfast in the cook's face, stomped around the throne room for exactly 18 minutes, muttering all the terrible things he'd do to those who dared sabotage his ambitions, and tried but ultimately failed to bite a random dog that had wandered in. Yet, as far as the royal vizier could discern, from his safe post just out of reach, the king was in an unusually good mood. Hopeful that this was the case, the vizier dared to approach the throne, and within reach of the king's scepter. Before speaking, "Shall I report the day's schedule, your majesty?" The king asked around the rib he gnawed on. His growling and smacking echoed off the throne room's high marble ceiling, and there were far, far too many food stains left on the carpet and other finery. Even hunched over, the king was absurdly tall, twice as tall as the vizier, which was far too tall for what the throne had been designed to hold. Though, admittedly, the throne was also a fair bit wider than its currently slobbering occupant, so it was an awkward fit all around. "Oh, right. That," he sneered resentfully. Why is being king so much work?" "If you'll recall, your majesty," the vizier began respectfully, pretending not to notice all the meat juices that spilled on the king's robes as he ate, not to mention the once sacred throne. "You have been trying to take over the kingdom for years. Yes, I know," the king growled in that high-pitched, nasally voice of his, as he distractedly swung his scepter at the vizier's head. Vizier Humphrey easily avoided the blow, but clapped his hands and made an oof sound to make the king think otherwise. When King Macready showed no signs of pursuing any further attacks, Humphrey resumed his royal duties for the usurper. "Top of the list, it saddens me to inform you that—" "On with it!" King Macready slammed his fist to the throne and jostled his crown loose. It was far too big for him, and maintaining a kingly look was a constant chore. The royal robes had needed extensive tailoring to fit his frame, which was starkly different from their old wearer. All forms of royal footwear had long been sold or repurposed, on account of the king's clawed feet repeatedly tearing through the expensive silk. However, of all the changes made, no one would dare suggest altering the crown. It was a priceless treasure, a symbol of absolute power, and the object of the king's deepest desire for far too long. He valued this golden piece of bejeweled headwear more than his life, some said. "You didn't say that." "Never, your majesty. Anyway, the first item on the royal agenda is regarding the royal treasury." That snapped the king to attention, causing him to callously discard the rib bone, somewhere that it would probably stain. "My money? What about it?" Macready snarled, his lips parting to showing rows of razor predatory teeth. "Simply put," Humphrey continued implacably, "compared to your initial ascension," he said as though the word were fake, "it's half gone." Half gone? The king stood to his full height, towering over the diminutive gray raccoon man. "Where'd it go? Money doesn't just sprout legs and walk away, does it?" Given the amount of magic he'd encountered in his life, it seemed like a fair query. "No, Your Majesty." "And someone took it! Someone took my money! Guards!" Two creatures in shiny metal armor hurried as quickly as they dared into the throne room. The wolf and tiger were of nearly identical builds, and stopped several paces from the throne before standing at attention. "Yes, Your Majesty," they saluted as one, diligent and dutiful even before the usurper. "Someone broke into the vault, my vault, and took my money. I demand a call to arms. Every knight in the kingdom is to go on high alert. There's a thief in our midst, one who isn't me," he said without a trace of irony. "And he made off with my money." Humphrey cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if you would let me finish, we already know where the money has gone." "What? Why didn't you say so sooner?" In that smug and superior way of his, Humphrey stared up at the king, his eyes wordlessly saying, "You're being serious right now." The overgrown lizard of a king snarled again, but Humphrey was like a rock and showed no signs of fear. Upon reflection, King Macready realized that he had jumped the gun just a little, though he'd never admit as much. Such weakness was what got the last king deposed, after all. "Just finish already," seethed the new king, his claws flexing in warning. "Yes, Your Majesty. As I was saying, the royal treasury is gone!" All eyes turned to the newcomer who'd stormed into the throne room. Princess Felicity was a fox, her fur a fetching shade of almost fiery orange, and her dress was a modest blue. Her eyes were also blue, but right now she looked angry enough to start shooting heat beams from those orbs. "Gone, gone, gone! The treasury's almost gone, and it's all your fault!" "My fault?" King Macready was astonished by the ghastly accusation. "I only just found out about the thief. It's the guard's duty to handle the defense stuff." "Defense stuff? Do you even hear yourself right now?" Felicity asked, aghast. If she were thinking clearly, she might have recognized how her father had often used a similar level of diction when describing important matters. Though, even if this had occurred to her, she would have been no more lenient to the filthy reptile who'd overthrown the rightful ruler. "Humphrey," she said through clenched teeth, "please inform our illustrious king where all the money has gone." "I was just getting to that, Your Highness." Humphrey cleared his throat to restart, showing only mild agitation at being interrupted again. "Regarding the royal treasury, it's—" "You spent it all!" finished Felicity. "All those tournaments and feasts have practically bankrupted the kingdom. All that money you love so much, you practically thrown it away." King Macready blinked rapidly. He wasn't surprised by the audacity of her words. Princess Felicity had always been a mouthy one. In all of their encounters during his failed attempts at taking the throne, she'd always made it a special point to personally tell him off. However, the old scaly hoarder took great umbrage at the other part of the fox's statement. "Are you insinuating that I, King Greedy Macready, don't know how to handle my money?" The former princess took several steps forward until she was well within Macready's personal space. Then, craning her neck back until she almost looked straight up, and mindful of the stains on his robes, she answered, "If the shoe fits, clawfoot." "Ah! You know I can't wear shoes." He stomped like a toddler throwing a tantrum. "And why do you always have to bring up my feet?" He then added, soft toe. And he clicked his toe claws to the tile floor in what was probably meant to be a threat. That doesn't change the fact that we don't have money to renovate the school, repair the aqueduct, or fix any of the other 100 things that have fallen apart since you usurped my father. Macready's eye twitched. Felicity was one of a handful of creatures who dared mention the old king, but he was too frustrated about everything else to pay that much mind. And what do you want me to do about it, You're the king, she groused. This is your responsibility. So either figure it out or step aside for someone who can. I should have eaten you a long time ago. Having seen the king inhale several cooked chickens in a single meal, the guards were suddenly very fearful for the former princess. Go ahead and try, Felicity dared. I'll just lodge myself in your throat till you choke. It'll be my last royal act in service to my kingdom. The guards gasped in horror, certain that the princess just might do such a thing out of spite. But one individual saw fit to be the voice of reason. And then we'd have no ruler at all, Humphrey cut in, catching the bickering pair by surprise. What do you mean? My father's still in the dungeon. He can do nothing. Though his face did not show it, the old raccoon found far too much delight in being the interrupter for a change, even if the topic was a grim one. I'm sorry to say, Your Highness, but it needs to be said. The former king is in no fit state to rule. He hasn't been for the better part of 3 moons. I went to visit him just the other day, and the poor man didn't even recognize me. Though Humphrey's words were stoic, it was the faintest tremble of hurt in his delivery. Felicity tried to emulate her old mentor's unflappable expression, but she was not as well practiced. She held on to her angry scowl as she wiped the building moisture from her eyes. I know that. I've known it for a long time. But what else am I supposed to do? King Macready found himself feeling very confused. On the one hand, he hated how these two were talking like he wasn't even in the room. That was just rude, even if he wasn't king, which he absolutely was. He adjusted his crown to confirm that this indeed was the case. But more so, he very inexplicably hated seeing Felicity cry. In the old days, back when the old king was at least aware of himself and the would-be king was nothing but a schemer and tinkerer in a shack, Macready would have relished the chance to make the mouthy former princess weep at his victory. But now that it was happening, he found that he utterly loathed the sight. Somehow, these two hates seemed to be at odds with one another, so he first addressed the stronger hate. I am the strongest and smartest in the land, began the king, with Grumble Bumble as my enforcer. There is not a soul in Happy Kingdom that would dare challenge me. I'm not going anywhere, and no one's going to take this kingdom that I worked so hard to take first. Felicity met the tall lizard's growl with one of her own, though she still had to blink back the tears. That said, Macready continued, bracing himself for a tough admission, I've never run a kingdom before. For the first time in many moons, Humphrey's brow made the quizzical climb up his forehead. As an inventor, I'm well acquainted with the concept of trial and error. Half my genius creations blow up on the first try. His words bordered on bragging. Minor setbacks, but I keep on trying new ways until I find one that works. Then I'm unstoppable. King Macready cut his cackling short, remembering that there was a point to be made. Now, my latest creation is that of a king. The perfect king for Happy Kingdom. Obviously, that's me. Always has been. But, like any great work of genius, there are setbacks along the way. The tall lizard's gaze flickered between the vizier and former princess. Suddenly he experienced the unwelcome and foreign sensation of awkwardness. In wondering where this had come from, his genius mind momentarily considered that he actually cared what these two thought of him. But no, that was just absurd. Clearly, there had to be some other reason, but he'd deal with that later. What do you mean by setbacks? Felicity tensely asked. This whole treasury mess. I've never run a kingdom, so, of course, I'm going to stumble along the way. Doesn't make me any less of a perfect king, though. That's exactly what it means, you stupid clawfoot, Felicity thought, trying to project her curses directly into Macready's mind. If you're trying to think me to death, don't bother. I've been down that route, and even my genius couldn't get around that dead end. Gotten off track. Where was I? You were explaining how encountering troubles makes you no less of a perfect king, Humphrey deadpanned. As your majesty says, you are the strongest. Ever since the humans stopped coming, we've become powerless before you, he explained, though he faced Felicity the entire time. And since your majesty is here to stay, the most prudent option to maintain the kingdom would be to ensure your perfection. Ensure? Asked Felicity, not yet comprehending what her old mentor said. The very notion of actually helping greedy Macready was just too alien. For example, the next time His Majesty is in the mood for another tournament, I can draw lines on the treasury walls to demonstrate just how far that beautiful pile of gold falls. Felicity's eyes widened in understanding, and her mouth opened in a silent "oh." King Macready pulled his clawed hands close and shuddered. Yep, that'd make me think twice. Then, realizing that his body language showed less than the pinnacle of strength, the king straightened up to a more kingly posture. The robes that belonged to the old king fit loosely around his slender frame and barely reached past his knees, when the old lizard didn't hunch. Yes, well, I'm so glad that you agree with my idea. Brilliant as ever, your majesty, Humphrey magnanimously replied. And Felicity, I believe you were about to follow the king's orders as well. I was? She was. Oh, yes, assured Humphrey. Some time ago, in fact, your majesty had explained how, in contrast to frivolous wants like tournaments, things like the aqueduct should be placed at the top of our priorities. The king scratched his head under his loose crown, tipping it slightly. I said that? Well, not in so many words, your majesty, Humphrey admitted, carefully selecting what to say next. But any true king is aware of the necessity of water for the crops, livestock, and citizens. Without water, no one can work, and if no one can work, then there can be no tax revenue, and the treasury will continue to shrink. Spend money to make money, as they say. Scowling so deep that his scales were wrinkling, King Macready lowered himself down to one knee and looked Humphrey dead in the eye. Felicity cringed and readied herself for action. She'd fought and served the old lizard long enough to know what this look meant, and she wondered if she could get one of the guard's weapons in time. Growling like a gator, King Macready extended his free hand. His claws flexed in the sunlight from the windows, almost shining at times. Humphrey remained unmoved as the appendage inched its way ever closer. And then, when the claw was close enough to the raccoon's face to inflict permanent injury, the king flicked the vizier's nose. "Don't put words in my mouth," Macready hissed. "Explain it to me if you must, but never pretend to speak for me. I am king. Only my word is law. Get me!" Humphrey wiggled and scratched his nose. It was wet, but didn't seem to be bleeding. "I get you, your majesty." "Good." King Macready stood back to his full height and adopted a more regal posture. "Lady Felicity," he proclaimed, his voice echoing off the walls. "Yes, your majesty?" Deciding to play along, the former princess gave the usurper a curtsy. "By my decree as king, you are to do that thing Humphrey said about the aqueduct. Fix it or whatever." He turned on his heel and marched back to the throne. "Blast it, being king is hard," he muttered. "It will be done, your majesty." Felicity curtsied again, making sure Macready's back still faced them. She gave Humphrey a wink and mouthed, "Thank you." He respectfully nodded back, and she went on her royally appointed task. When she'd left the throne room and felt safe in being out of earshot, she said to herself, "This could work."